Hello, friends. Lee C. Camp here. You're listening to No Small Endeavor. This is our unabridged interview with poet, theologian, and host of Poetry Unbound, Pádraig Ó Tuama. This is our second time to welcome Pádraig to No Small Endeavor. I loved the second conversation as much as the first one with Pádraig. From the first episode that we did a number of years ago, this may have been back during the pandemic, maybe. I think it was. We recorded Pádraig for a live online show during the pandemic. And there's some beautiful sections, some beautiful readings from Pádraig on our YouTube channel that you might want to check out. And we'll include those in the links to the show notes for the edited podcast version of this interview with Pádraig. But you might want to check those out. Really lovely. This is the third part of our three-part series on what is poetry's role when the world is burning, and a lovely conversation with Pádraig. Pádraig's now mostly in the United States, living in New York currently, and his presence is coveted at a lot of institutions because he's done such remarkable work, and he always has such thoughtful and reflective, beautiful things to say. Enjoy. Here's Pádraig Ó Tuama. Hey, friend, if you didn't know, I started a newsletter a while back that comes out every 2 weeks. I've been delighted to hear from so many of you about the positive response to the newsletter. We call it the No Small Endeavor Notebook, where I riff on themes and topics related to our podcast, giving you additional material for thinking and doing in your own quest to make sense of what it might mean to live a good life. Join us by going now to nosmallendeavor.com and sign up there. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com to sign up now for our free No Small Endeavor Notebook newsletter.
Hey, it's Jacob Lewis, executive producer of No Small Endeavor. My icon? Lee C. Camp. I get to see his days up close and personal. Studio in the morning, writing over lunch, live event before the ink dries. If I lived in his shoes for a day, I'd be begging for a nap. Our icons run hot, so the fuel's got to keep up. That's why I reach for cassava. Like the icons we love, I need nourishment that moves with me wherever the day goes. First off, cassava is delicious. More milkshake than chalky health drink. I'm a chocolate guy. 2 scoops, cold water, oat milk, couple ice cubes. Sometimes I even put a splash of iced coffee, and I'm out the door. 30 seconds, and I feel clear, focused, and full for hours. It's got all the good stuff your mind and body crave for whole body health. With every 2 scoops, you get 85 plus superfoods, nutrients, and plant-based ingredients. You can try cassava risk-free with their Love It guarantee. Thousands of rave reviews agree you're going to love it. So, make your day iconic with cassava. Go to cassava.com and use code NSE for 15% off your next order. That's cassava, KACHAVA.com, code NSE for 15% off.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra, the official beer partner of the NBA, is bringing NBA fans closer than ever this season with chances to win great prizes, including courtside tickets. Enter now at michelobultra.com/courtside. Michelob Ultra courtside 25 to 26. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents 21 plus. Begins on October 1st, 2025 and ends on June 30th, 2026. Multiple entry periods. See official rules at michelobultra.com/courtside for free entry deadlines, prizes, and details.
Pádraig Ó Tuama is a poet, theologian, peacemaker. From 2014 to 2019, he was the leader of the Corrymeela community, Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. He's also the host of On Being's Poetry Unbound. He's published numerous volumes of poetry, essays, a memoir, and theology. He currently resides in New York City, where he's a visiting scholar at the Center for Cooperation and Conflict Resolution at Columbia University. We're pleased to welcome him back to No Small Endeavor for a second time. Welcome back, Pádraig.
Thanks very much, Lee. Nice to be with you.
It's good to be with you again. And I remember our first conversation with a lot of fondness, and grateful to get to spend some time with you again today. We're doing a series with 3 poets, and the premise for the series is taken from Chris Wiman's memoir, My Bright Abyss. And Chris says, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? And then he points to the sort of endless wars, environmental degradation, and all of the various ways in which we have this very perceived and real sense that things in certain ways are falling apart and burning. And while we may rage in various ways against the injustice of all of that, or the oppression entailed in all of that, that it becomes so difficult to disentangle ourselves from our own kind of privilege that we might have. And so he then asked that question, what is poetry's role when the world is burning? And so I wonder if we could just start there and just ask you, what's top of mind for you that you would want to most clearly say that what is poetry's role when the world is burning?
Well, I always stumble over the word role when it comes to art. I think poetry and art is an event, and it isn't a project, it isn't a strategic plan. You don't do it so that you get something else. And I don't think you can predict what a role is. I think poetry's demand can be spoken about. Poetry's event or phenomenon can be spoken about. And in that situation, what we can say is that art is made by people from all cultures and in all kinds of circumstances. And sometimes it is part of the resistance, and sometimes it's part of the grief, and sometimes it's part of the survival, and sometimes it's written by people who are part of the problem. There's no morality in a certain sense to art because it has occurred everywhere. So we can say that it is a phenomenon that's at the center of the human project, and for good or ill. And I suppose, like all things, we hope it can be used for good.
I'm fascinated with what you said there about there is no morality as such in art. Unpack that for us a little bit more.
Well, it's a nice idea to think that lofty words are accompanied by lofty action, but that's not the case. Edmund Spenser, the writer of The Fairy Queen, was also wrote kind of pretty terrible rhetoric on behalf of the British government about their so-called colonies, Ireland being one of them. So, that's just one example. We could go through many where people who are profoundly skilled and profoundly committed to their art form and write some very beautiful things, perhaps about nature, they were not given to thinking about people when it came to some of their work, and they wrote about people, women or people from other countries or people from colonies that their country might have made. They wrote about them without the kind of intellectual rigor that they might have given sometimes to a flower or to a bird. And we've all got ways in which we've got limitations, but it is too easy to think that lofty words lead to lofty action. They don't always. We also know that liquid words can sometimes make people feel in a certain way where it can be difficult to challenge. And in that way, perhaps the loftier your language is, the more careful people need to be when they listen to you, because you could be easily fooled.
You, as I understand, you began to be captivated by poetry from a very young age. I think I read something like, I didn't write this down, but I think I read you were like memorizing like 70 poems a year or something as a 9-year-old. Is that?
Yeah, well, not just me. It was the education system. Poetry is so important in Irish culture. So we were learning poems off by heart, one in Irish, Gaelic, you might say, and one in English every week for between the ages of 5 to 17. So that was about 70 poems a year, half in English, half in Irish.
And it's great. That's incredible. When you look back on that experience, and I'm trying to avoid instrumentalizing language because you pointed us to be careful of that in your opening comment. But how would you say that formed you? What did that do to you? How did that dispose you towards the world, do you think?
Well, I suppose it just meant that you always thought that poetry was part of everything. Lots of the poems we learned in Irish were poems about the struggle against British presence in Ireland. And so I suppose one of the things that pointed to was that art has always concerned itself with contemporary life. And so I hear sometimes people saying, oh, it's kind of annoying the way poetry has turned political lately. And I think, well, poetry's always been political, and I mean, the Irish tradition is not an old tradition regarding that. You look at the poetry of the Hebrew Bible, that's political too, Yeah. And so I suppose that was one of the things that it pointed to. Some of the poets whose work we were learning off by heart in Irish were executed by the British because of their desire or their involvement in revolutions for Irish independence. So sometimes that we would have been learning the poetry of a particular writer in Irish language class and then learning about the life and the politics of that particular poet in history class. And that I think was a very interesting approach to it. I don't want to idealize the Irish education system. Like, plenty of the learning off by heart was just, what did the poet mean in stanza 2? And please don't give us your personal opinion. So it wasn't a kind of a, oh my God, here's how I put myself into the middle of it. I happened to love it. So, but like, my younger brother hates Sylvia Plath, but he can quote lengthy sections of Sylvia Plath to tell you why he does not like the poetry of Sylvia Plath. So that's one of the benefits of that system. So it doesn't make for a nation of poetry lovers necessarily. It does make for a nation of opinionated people about poetry.
Yeah. I once saw you describe in a lecture fairly recently, you described conflict as performative, and I had not quite thought of it that way. So unpack some of that for us. What do you mean conflict is performative, and how would you also see poetry as potentially something performative in the midst of such conflict?
Oh, well, what an interesting segue. I was curious as to what the jump to conflict and performance was. I'll talk about the conflict and performance thing first, and I'll see if I have anything interesting to say about the poetry part. First of all, I should say, by saying it's a performance, I don't mean to demean it, and I don't mean to lighten it in any way. Within the context of that, I sometimes think of conflict as a stage, and we can get caught up with what's happening on the stage, between the characters on the stage. What I think can be helpful is to think of conflict as a theatre. And when you go to see a piece of theatre, of course, you're meant to be captivated by what's happening on stage. But what we also know is that in theatre, there's what's happening behind the stage. Who's the director? Who's written it? Who's making money? And in that way, sometimes when I see a conflict that's unfolding, it can be easy to be distracted by the drama about what's being sometimes performed and sometimes pretended there, when what really might need to be the serious question is who's making money from this? Who thinks that this is entertainment? Who is creating an environment where the spectacle on a pretty predictable plotline that's happening on stage might actually be hiding something much more malevolent behind? And that's what I mean by thinking about the wider theatrical elements that go into a conflict. And we all know sometimes where somebody might overreact and then suddenly they can seem to de-escalate very quickly. And perhaps if you know them, or if it's you, they might say afterwards, oh yeah, I was just doing that because I wanted to show them something about, don't mess with me. And whatever it is that's going on. And there can often be back layers, under layers, as well then as money making behind it. Sometimes people can perform a conflict because they know that it will achieve a certain kind of goal, and you can capitalize on outrage in order to slip something by. In politics, for instance, I noticed this a lot in Belfast, where something terrible might have come out from local parliament and Stormont in Belfast. And meanwhile, while people are outraged, some pieces of legislation are slipped through nice and quietly while you're being outraged about the terrible thing that somebody said. And in that way, that can be a performance. And knowing we can manipulate an audience with a plotline that will drive them mad, but they'll have forgotten it next week. Meanwhile, we've slipped something through quietly. And in that way, I suppose those are some of the layers that I mean when I think about conflict and the question of performance.
How then do you think of something about, to go to that segue, how do you think about the possibility of a construct, a work like poetry, helping us begin to see such things or form us in such a way? I guess maybe my question might be, first, there's a sort of personal question of when and how did you begin to pay attention to that wiliness? And second, in what way, if any, does your formation in poetry and your work in poetry help inform your attentiveness to that kind of wiliness?
When did I begin to pay attention to it? I suppose the same as us all, in a certain sense, with age. I don't think I had a natural capacity to not be deceived. But I think it's just age and disappointment, and probably seeing some of the same dynamics in myself. I don't want to stand outside that and say that I am outside of those kinds of models of deceit. I hope not to practice them, but I don't claim any quick shortcut away from that. And like poetry, one of the things that poetry is the practicing of noticing, the practicing of looking, and not necessarily by great poetic language, but sometimes by very simple language, by being able to see something really clearly and to name it. And that art of noticing, that art of looking, I think can help us when there's the possibility of recognizing that sometimes what is beneath things actually is also being manifested on the surface. There can be an idea that we need to get beneath the surface sometimes to comprehend the dynamics about what are going on. But from time to time, things are right there in the surface, and it's not a matter of analysing it deeply. It's a matter of having the capacity to look at what is plainly present in front of you.
I love that phrase, the art of noticing. And in various ways, a lot of times it gets put under the term intentionality, but I hear from guests repeatedly about taking seriously learning to pay attention, and what you're calling there the art of noticing. And obviously we live in a culture that's so caught up in the economic possibilities of distracting us. And but what have you found to be helpful for yourself in regularly cultivating the art of noticing and not getting distracted from paying attention?
Well, with any practice of paying attention, mine happens to be poetry, but for other people it might be just 10 minutes of silence, or it might be a particular walk, or it can be all kinds of practices of prayer or meditation as well. I think anything that holds you steady just becomes a daily linchpin for returning to a place from which you can analyze what else is happening. And that kind of practice can make a big difference in our life. It doesn't have to be 3 hours a day. I think something small that is doable and fits in with your time can be a fantastic thing. Some people only have the few minutes while the coffee is brewing. If you can take that, that's great. And so it doesn't have to be something that feels unachievable. It can start with what is simply achievable, and what is simply achievable might seem tiny, but it can be enough for the start. And so I think any practice like that can be a huge help for attuning yourself to the breath, for perhaps setting aside the distraction about what's saying to you, be angry at this, be happy at this, be anxious about this, be worried about this, compare yourself to this. All of these things that compete for our attention that really tie into some very self-destructive patterns that can be part of us. And marketing really plays on that an enormous amount. Not just you need this, but you need to be seen to have this by other people. And those psychologies are deep in us and can be manipulated by whatever it is that's grabbing our attention. And for me, poetry is something about trying to move away from those complicated languages. Mary Oliver has a great line where, I think in the poem called Prayer, I'm sure I'm misquoting it, but she says, "I know a lot of fancy words. I tear them from my tongue and then I pray." Good line, isn't it?
Indeed. So in the first interview I got to do with you, we talked at some length about your work with the Corrymeela community and the peacemaking and reconciliation work you did there. But I'm wondering, I don't recollect us having talked about the way in which poetry may or may not have actually functioned in that work. What did that look like for you during that time of your season of your life?
Well, I was poet in residence for the Corrymeela community, which is Ireland's oldest peace and reconciliation community. I went on to lead Corrymeela then 10 years after that, but my first involvements with Corrymeela were all as poet in residence. And what that involved was being part of encounters between people who were coming together in the aftermath of conflict. And sometimes those were representatives of groups from cities that might have had problems with each other. Sometimes those were representatives of bereaved people who had lived through terrorism and paramilitarism and police brutality, and people who might have found it painful to be in a room with representatives of members of another community. And I was there partly as a facilitator, but one of the facilitation tools we used for reframing was that in the week between, because typically people would meet once a week for a period of time, 6 months, 12 months. In the week in between the meetings, I would try to write a poem to speak back to what it was that people had witnessed amongst each other. They were never partisan poems, and they were not poems written for the purposes of kind of publishing in literary magazines. They were poems whose primary purpose and primary aim was to see if you could create a linguistic and emotional echo of what had happened in the week before, where some kind of recognizability, but also perhaps a certain sense of reframing, of being able to look at something. Reframing is a term used a lot in conflict resolution, but if you think about it literally, it can be very helpful. If you have a photograph or a piece of art that's been framed poorly, people might think, I can barely see it. And then if it happens to be framed really well in a different way, to be reframed really well, people might go, wow, I can really see what's there now, because somebody has done a beautiful job. And that's part of the art in conflict resolution, of reframing, of being able to simply look at something, and that might involve grief, or it might involve information, or it might involve point of view. But in all of it, you are trying to reframe for the possibility of being able to contain it. You can't change the past, in any intervention. But the hope is that you can look at the past in such a way that other things can happen. Maybe a bit of distance, maybe a bit of change, maybe a bit of wisdom, maybe a bit of accountability or confession, all of those kinds of things.
Any particular instances come to mind of that happening?
Yeah, I was just thinking that I'd open up a poem and read it for you and tell you some of the story of one of them. Let me just find one of them here. So I was one time there as facilitator and artist in residence for an event that involved people from both sides of the border in Ireland, north and south. So people whose politics were either mostly Irish or mostly British, which is really the heart of the conflict there. Religion is the manifestation about how those distinctions are seen. But really the question isn't, do you or do you not believe in a particular theology about Mary? The question really is do you think that the north of Ireland, that partitioned part, is or should be British or Irish? And then in the room also there was people, Israelis and Palestinians, of a whole variety of different points of view. And many people in the room had suffered terribly, awful grievances and awful pain. And so I was interested in thinking what could be done. At one point somebody in the room said that they had murdered someone, and somebody else in the room said, never use the word murder, because what you were doing was ordered by a higher up. So you were just following orders. And if lives were lost, lives were lost. And so a debate broke out in the room about language. And sometimes we can talk about language as if it's this esoteric thing, and that talking about words is just talking about words. But this was a group of people who were seriously reckoning with the accountability that comes with the language that you use. And then somebody else in the room said, well, I only ever shot at legitimate targets, so, that's how I explain my actions. And somebody else said, well, I suppose that made me a legitimate target when your organization shot at me when I was 8 or 10. I can't remember what age they said. So anyway, here's a part of a poem called The Pedagogy of Conflict. When I was a child, I learned to count to 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But these days I've been counting lives. So I count one life, one life, one life, one life, one life. Because each time is the first time that life has been taken. Legitimate target has 16 letters and one long, abominable space between two dehumanizing words. So that poem, as part of a reflection back to that group, the idea really was to say, this is what you said, and then to see what happens when people hear what it is that they've said.
That's a incredible. It's so deeply moving, not knowing the context, but then knowing the context and thinking about. I'm imagining you sharing that to give feedback on what you had heard them say. Do you recollect what kind of response you got from the room as you shared that?
Well, I think in the room, people just thought, oh, yeah, that is what we said. Yeah. I mean, being present as artist in residence in a room means that you're tuned into a particular way, and you're trying to listen not only for content, but for a doorway to open in order to be able to say something, and not something partisan, but also not something so limpid and vacuous that it's just fantasizing about a neutral middle ground that won't offend anybody. You're really looking for something of power, some language of potency that somehow might change what it's like to look at the scene that you're painting through the language, including yourself. You know, I don't do that from a position of power, because I'm the one waiting for what it is. As a poet in residence, I'm the one waiting for what it is that I hear that changes me. So the art is coming, the art is outside me as well. I happen to be the one lucky enough to be tasked with trying to do something. But it's reciprocal, and it's exchanged enormously. So in that room, yeah, I think people just thought, this is what we said.
When you think back about, let's see, it's been how many years since you were executive director there?
I was leader. There's a few roles in Corrymeela. When was it? I finished in 2019.
Okay, so 6 years out. As you look back on that experience 6 years prior, what would you say are some of the most important formative experiences or intellectual constructs or dispositions that were formed in you through that experience?
So one of the things that comes to mind is that any group that sets itself up to address a particular complicated societal manifestation will have to face in themselves the very thing that they say they're set up to address. So a group that's set up to be a communication group will have to face their lack of communication internally. A group that's set up to name and to speak about peace and to promote peace will have to face their own internal lack of peace. And that is not a manifestation of hypocrisy, or it doesn't have to be. Really what it is, it's the first sign that you're engaging. And then the next thing is, and how are you engaging? And often what I see happening in peace groups is that when they begin to face their own serious internal difficulties, and there's some that are just easy, they'll go, oh, yeah, no, that's easy. But you'll always find, when the work is happening, you'll always find that something that you couldn't predict would manifest the opposite of what the thing that you're set up for will find a way to sneak up and present something to you. And the question is really, how do we not be shocked, but how do we address it? And how do we turn to each other? And how do we not resort to the very tactics that we see outside the group to be manifested inside the group? And so if you're in, like we have been in the north of Ireland, in a situation where sectarianism and pitting, going against each other and performing a certain neutral form of engagement without telling somebody on the other side what it is you really think, how is that going to manifest itself inside an organization for peace, for instance? One of the things that I love about Corrymeela, and Corrymeela is a peace organization, it's filled with frustrations, one of the things I do love about Corrymeela in the community is that people are quick to point out when it is that somebody's scapegoating somebody else. So if somebody's saying, well, we're doing this, and if it wasn't for that group, well then, things would be much easier. There's a really good culture of somebody just shouting out in the middle. That's just scapegoating. And that can be confronting, especially if you're in a position of leadership and you find yourself going, oh my God, yes it is. But isn't that part of the purpose, for the inconvenience of not being able to get away with doing the very thing that you say you're set up to be against? And you will have to face it. The question is do you have the mechanisms to cope when you face it? So that's a big thing for me as I think about peace.
So when you say that this, when you say that we often find that, say, your example, a group wanting to help facilitate communication has to face their own lack of internal communication, or a community that's seeking to facilitate peacemaking or reconciliation has to face their own internal lack of peaceableness. And then you said, but that's not hypocrisy. So is it not hypocrisy because I understand you to be saying precisely because a given group of people have given themselves to try to do a particular work, that gives them the facility to be able to see the lack of the insufficient development, formation of that in themselves? Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, well, maybe by saying it's not hypocrisy mightn't be a helpful framing of it. But I suppose I do want to say that, like, anybody can feel discouraged when you join a group that's got a good purpose. And then you might go, I joined this group that's got a great purpose. But then 6 months in, a year in, 6 years in, I just began to realize that they had these big problems on the inside. That is ahead of you, no matter what group you join.
Right.
Disappointment is ahead of all of us. And for me, of course, it's not that you have to stay there. You might go, actually, it's too much, I want to leave. But I think when we can attune ourselves to the fact that every human-led organization is going to stumble, and also that every organization that's probably overworked and underfunded, that is set up particularly to address a problem, is going to face problems of their own. You can prepare yourself a little bit for the disappointment so that you're not shocked when it comes about. And perhaps you can even cultivate something internally that, rather than thinking those people out there are the ones who are always doing the problem, and if, that they are the only problem, they might be a serious problem, but internally the mechanisms for knowing how it is your own organization work, that dynamics of power are going to show up there too. And possibly dynamics of power that are closely linked to the dynamics of power that you're being critical of out there. And it isn't to say that you don't have a mission. You probably do. But the question for me is, how will you face the fact that you're going to struggle with each other as well as struggle with people outside? And that, I think, is something that I learned deeply, mostly through failure, and mostly through frustration. So I suppose I'm saying this in terms of the years working within these peace organizations of looking at those things. Sometimes I would think it's easier to work with paramilitary groups than it is to lead the committee at Corrymeela, because at least the threats in a paramilitary group are explicit, whereas sometimes the threats in a peace organization are much more subtle and complex and pervasive and poisonous. If somebody said, issues a direct threat, well, then you can address the direct threat. If somebody looks in your face and pretends to be sweetness and light, but actually is being vicious and undermining behind you and then denying that's much more difficult to know how to speak to.
Hello, friends. Lee Seacamp here. Do you ever wish you had more folks to discuss the conversations we offer on No Small Endeavor? Something like a podcast listening club where you could engage big ideas about what it means to live life well and then discuss it with friends and companions? If so, you have stumbled upon the announcement you have been waiting for. We're pleased to announce the start of Endeavor Together, our new initiative that equips and nurtures close-knit communities to talk about the things you actually want to talk about. Each small group conversation series is built upon our podcast content and provides you with super easy to use content with questions, videos, links, and guidance so that you or any good and willing soul can host small group conversations exploring what it means to live a good life. Maybe you'll meet in homes around a table, maybe in a coffee shop or local park, maybe at work during lunch hour, maybe in a church Sunday school class. What we are providing is the scaffolding for good conversation. The rest is up to you. And here's the best part. Thanks to generous support from the Lilly Endowment, it's free. The first 2 series have been released. The first, Let's Disagree Better, and the second, Vulnerability. Get started today. Visit nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Again, go to nosmallendeavor.com and click on Endeavor Together. Enjoy.
Does it ever feel like you're a marketing professional just speaking into the void? But with LinkedIn ads, you can know you're reaching the right decision makers, a network of 130 million of them, in fact. You can even target buyers by job title, industry, company, seniority, skills, and did I say job title? See how you can avoid the void and reach the right buyers with LinkedIn ads. Spend $250 on your first campaign and get a free $250 credit for the next one. Get started at linkedin.com/campaign. Terms and conditions apply.
Finished training for the day? Time to fight post-workout fatigue with Core Power Protein Shakes. They're packed with 26 grams of high-quality protein to build muscle and electrolytes to help hydrate. The nutrition you need to help your body replenish, rebuild, and repair post-workout so you can power on to the next one. Champion your recovery with Core Power. Visit corepower.com to learn more.
So you've pointed several times already in our conversation to the power of words, the need for accountability for our words. And so I kind of like to shift a moment and think a little bit about theology and conflict and poetry, all centering around the power of words. And first, ask how you see theological commitments, theological engagement, theological constructs shaping the way you write, how you read poetry, or where you are in just simply you're seeking to live life these days.
Well, I mean, I was born in 1975, so I grew up in a particular kind of era of Irish Catholicism, maybe the last era of Irish Catholicism. Things have changed a lot, but I suppose they were changing generation to generation leading up to me as well, or leading up to my life. But like, if you cut me, I bleed Catholic. And that's got very little to do with questions about personal belief and devotion. It's just entirely cultural in the sense of, I just went to an ordinary village school, but it was, a Catholic maintained school. So the priest and the life of the church was involved. I happened to come from a very devout family, so that was enormous. And for a long time, I tried to be very devout too. And some of that was devotion and some of that was fear. And so my engagement with a literature of life and a mythology, and I mean that positively, as in an arranging principle of story, was primarily religious and primarily Catholic and primarily Irish Catholic, all of those internal distinctions. So that has absolutely manifested a way that I think about the world, a certain way that I think about literature in some edges too, but of course, much of the poetry that we were learning in school and that I read has got very, very little interest to do with religion, of course. It might be much more political or just nature-based or beauty or language-based. But theology and religious ways of thinking and the power of a religious idea to have political consequences or local consequences or national ones, and some of those fruitfully and some of those to levels of terror. I've seen that, as many people around the world have. Billions of people have seen that around the world in very serious ways. And that's got nothing to do with whether they're personally religious. It's got everything to do with growing up in an environment where the language of religion has often overlapped with the language of power and the language of country.
In your introduction, I think it was, to the 7 Deadly Sonnets, you at one point said, and you're speaking, as I recollect here, with the context of your own sort of perhaps early childhood experiences with the faith of your youth, the way to break a man is to make him hate himself.
Indeed.
Do you unpack some of that for us?
Yeah. So, I mean, 7 Deadly Sonnets was a sequence of poems I wrote about having gone through exorcisms and reparative therapies for getting rid of the gay in me. And it was 15 years after all of that I began writing them, and those sonnets, there's 7 of them, and they took years to write. I wrote so many and just kept on going over and over and over and changing them and replacing some of them. And I was interested to write about those experiences from a good lot of years afterwards. So I wasn't writing them in the midst of the pain or the shock of all of that. I was much more interested in being able to look at them from a point of view of distance. And in some ways, the man who went through that felt like a different country, which was beneficial. And writing the poems helped me make some distance between myself and myself in a very, very helpful way. And so that poem, it's the third of the 7 Deadly Sonnets. It does say, though it begins, the words you quoted are the opening lines. The way to break a man is to make him hate himself. So I found myself at doorways, one of the top of steps where my exercisers waited, getting absolution from a priest who thrust his crotch into my face, shaking outside a bar I was too chaste to enter. The context of this was that the third exorcism I was put through was, the first one was pretty kind of ridiculous and dramatic and loud and shocking amongst a lot of people in a charismatic prayer group. The second one was just with men. I think they might have decided that seeing as the first one was unsuccessful to get rid of all the gay devils in me, that I needed a second one with just men. And then when I said to somebody later on that my temptations, as I was kind of being schooled to call them, were not gone, I was just 18. My God, I was a child and confused and frightened. Anyway, that person then said, well, look, here's the last thing to try, which is to that you do an exorcism on yourself. So he said, go into that room there. And he said, close the door. I think he might have even said, lock the door. And don't come out until you've done an exorcism on yourself. And many years later, it struck me that is a certain form of divide and conquer, that to divide and conquer a person, to make you hate yourself. That is a tactic that colonizers used the world over, and that anybody who wants to break apart a group uses. It's a horrifically successful and manipulative tactic and technology that has been around for a very long time for diabolical purposes. So looking back, I suppose I saw that the demon was that form of thinking. Rather, of course, I didn't have demons in me. I don't believe in demons. But what I do believe in is that people can make you feel like you do. And that's what I wanted to look at in those poems in many ways, was the dynamics of that kind of diabolical activity, which is much more subtle and much more pervasive than what it was that was the high drama of an exorcism. Underneath that was the low manipulation of power and the way that a young, frightened gay guy was being tormented by different people.
Yeah. I mean, I'm particularly struck by Bible Belt, American Bible Belt Christianity that had its own form of Protestant sexual repression, fear, anxiety, that I had to take years to work through myself. And to know the way in which just these very brief moments can have such a profound impact upon an adolescent, and kind of self-hatred and deep anxiety that you can carry with you for decades. And I'm fascinated by, as well, you at one point said something like, when you're told you have the devil in you and you realize you don't, you start asking larger questions. And I think that, when I have thought at various times in my life of why did I go on and do so many years of theological study, I think it's partly what you just said right there. It's like there's a sort of drivenness to ask bigger, different, more compelling questions out of that experience of the ways in which the power of language can be so damaging and causing you to hate yourself. And then there's this sort of internal deep desire to try to figure out how can you then engage those larger questions in a way that can kind of contribute to not only the peace of the world, but to the peace of oneself. But I don't know, any other commentary on that or thoughts arise out of that confluence of things?
I have such admiration for people. So I was about 12 or 13 the first time I heard that gay people had devils in us, which is very frightening to hear, of course. I have such admiration for people that I know who heard similar things and then maybe within a few years just thought, to hell with it, forget it, and just left religion behind. I was never able to do that. I kind of needed to face the beast and that really has shaped my life and shaped my language, shaped my art, and shaped my intellectual activities too. I too spent many years doing various studies in religion. It felt necessary for me. It always felt like I had to stay and to try to figure it out. My ideas about religion have changed enormously, but I felt the need to wrestle with that which had started the bout with me. But that is not the only way to do it. I could very happily, had I found the wherewithal, just thought, oh, forget it, I'm going to go off and do a degree in Irish and linguistics, and just made that the thing that held me together, and it clearly already does. I could have just started to do degrees in poetry, because that also helped me. But somehow it was the religious part of it has been in there for a very long time and shaped me. We all have a certain form of narrative that holds us together. And sometimes that narrative is one that we wrestle with and that has been unkind or cruel to us. And for many people that might be religion, but it could also be your own constitution, or it could be your national constitution, or it could be, I don't know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, or it could be Harry Potter, or it could be whatever it is you wanted to say. I suppose I'm interested in, can the wrestle with that narrative be good enough? Because that narrative will never be good enough. There's always going to be the need to find a way to engage with it, and to, as decades go by, to deepen the wrestle with it, and to find more and more ways of being free within the context of that. And that, I think, is the life challenge that's presented by being part of any narrative. Not to look for the perfect one, but to look for a way to, with more and more integrity, manifest your own curiosity in the midst of whatever narrative you're part of.
So I'm so fascinated with what you said there about your admiration for those who at some point just said, to hell with it, and moved on.
I need to tell you that I was vastly trying to stop myself from swearing within the context of this. Your delicate ears, Lee, I didn't want to hurt them.
Well, I heard you say "to hell with it." Yeah, so I don't know if you said that or not, but
I did. Okay, I was trying to make sure I didn't say other things.
Please, to hell with it is a helpful way to get at it, right? But that difference between those who say to hell with it and then you go on alternatively and struggle with it, grapple with it, maybe is a better verb. Because I was back home just a number of months ago, and I had that same sort of experience where I thought, I drove into I didn't visit the church where I grew up in while I was home, but I drove through the parking lot a couple of times. And at one of those occasions when I drove through the parking lot, I thought, I've given too many years of continuing to argue those old things that I was taught as a kid. And I can just let that go now. But here I am, in my mid to late 50s. Whereas then I had dinner with a friend who had also had very painful kind of experiences, but she had just said, to hell with it, a long, long time ago. Yeah. And so I do wonder, what do you think it is about that some of us have that narrative where we have to keep grappling with it? What's that about, you think?
I don't know. I'm from a village in Cork, and I went back a number of years. My parents live there, and I went back and I bumped into somebody that I know from school, and she's always worked in the same village. And I found myself thinking about how I haven't. I left the day after I turned 18, and I've never lived back there again, really. And so maybe it's true that for all of us, whether in place or in imagination or fixation, there's going to be some things we stay with and some things we bring with us and some things we can't leave behind and some things we can. And so it's just a question as to what they are. But what really strikes me, Lee, is like if we were in a poetry writing workshop, I'd want to say to you, well, what's in the parking lot? What's growing? Can you hear birds? Is there a fence? Is there rubbish? What is the sound of your feet on it? What memory do you have of there? What's it like when what did you see in the parking lot when you left the church? What is right there in front of you that's vivid? What smells are in that parking lot? Is it different when it's filled with cars as to when it's not? Do you have a particular memory of something that happened in a quiet corner of the parking lot? All of those things, that would be so replete with speaking about the suburbs of your memory, because it can be easy to concentrate only on what happens inside the church building, when in fact, possibly one of the really interesting things that happens is when you leave that building and you begin to return to yourself, or return to your own capacity for your own curiosity, or your thoughts or your behaviors aren't going to be so monitored when you leave that church building. What happened? How could the parking lot be a place of permission and a place of noticing? So there's the poem for you to write. Write that before the next time we talk.
Or maybe I just need to have you go to Alabama with me next time I go.
I'd be delighted.
So I wonder, we've, in some ways, we've talked about the way in which the sort of work of reconciliation and the work of poetry have been crucial to your maybe public persona, public self. But how would you describe the way in which reframing made possible by poetry, or glimpsing new metaphors, or the art of attention, how has all of that worked within you personally? Or can you give us some examples of ways in which it helped you see or reframe things about yourself or your own experience that was redemptive for you in some way?
For a long time, the struggle was looking at myself as a gay man, and trying to face that in the context of the Ireland and the Catholicism that I grew up in, and the very, very heavily American evangelicalism that influenced the ecumenism that I was part of as well in Ireland. And trying to find my way in, through, and out of all of those was a necessary artistic and personal project for a long time. As I said, those can feel a very long time ago, but I still am trying to think about religion. Of course, it's not because it's a burden on me anymore, but because of the opposite. Really, I'm interested in the question of belief. There used to be some Protestant missionaries from Belfast would come down to Cork, and maybe because they thought that all Catholics were going to hell, they would set up these little evangelistic projects in our village, and I got to know them all. And they would sometimes stop the priest who was on his way in to say Mass and say, "Do you believe in God?" And they think they were being enormously radical by asking that confrontational question, instead of just being utterly patronizing and arrogant, And these were young people too, who were being shaped and formed by somebody who told them what to think and believe. So it wasn't like they were just kind of waking up one morning and thinking, "I'm going to be sectarian." We were all products of a system. So the question for me of "Do you believe in God?" has had a long history, and I was interested in trying to push into some of the spaciousness that could be in that question, so that rather than it being a yes or no question, that there could be an idea of, well, what does that question open? What door does it open? What's it like if the quality of the you is there with curiosity rather than demand or threat? So that's what I was really working on with the most recent book, Kitchen Hymns. I'll read one of the "Do You Believe in God" poems. There's 16 poems in this, all with the same title, "Do You Believe in God?" But here's one of them. "Do you believe in God?" "I don't believe in God," I said. And she said, "Oh, somehow I thought you'd managed to keep that going, even though I haven't." She asked if I'd told others. "Yes," I said, "I have. I mean, it's not like I'm saying I know about what is. It's just that the burden of belief isn't on me anymore. God, it feels much freer. I believe I'm in the room next to belief. I hear the sounds of prayers coming through the walls. I like the smell of incense and the sound of fabric, rustling fabric as the people stand or kneel. Sometimes I can tell the text by the intonation of the reader. I mutter the responses underneath my breath. Lift up your hearts." "And do you?" she asked. "Lift up your heart?" "Yes," I said, "I do. But I don't know to who." "Whom?" she said. let's get started on the soup.
That's so lovely.
So
I mean, I think the thing that is so compelling to me in that is the sort of, I mean, people who listen to our show and former students of mine would have heard me say ad nauseum. One of my favorite lines from the early church is Irenaeus, who said, the glory of God is a human being fully alive. And there's a sort of fully aliveness in that disbelief that you're describing there, right? And it's that it's a sort of lightness that has this beautiful way of being in the world.
And in the speaker of this poem, clearly has a deep religious interest. Being in the room next to a belief and listening in, and hasn't gone too far. But just needs to be in the parking lot of religion rather than in the church of religion. Perhaps that's the combination between your imagination and mine, Lee. But also what I really wanted, so for me, one of the arts of poetry is, you've got the topic that you're trying to write about, but then you're trying to do other things alongside it, and making sure you're trying to do 2 or 3 things at the same time means that your poem isn't just about being angry, or your poem isn't just about this thing, that somehow there's something else happening. And so in this poem especially, I was really interested in elongated vowel sounds, assonance. So just listen to vowel sounds in this. Forget what I'm saying, but listen to the vowel sounds in the opening stanza. I don't believe in God, I said. And she said, oh, somehow I thought you'd managed to keep that going, even though I haven't. So that's just most of the first stanza. So don't, oh, going, though. And so finding a way where there's a music in that particular piece that is doing, and that continues throughout the poem. Irish language poetry is filled with what Yeats called the Irish mode, which is elongated vowel sounds that create a certain syncopation of rhythm that isn't quite as formal as end-line rhyme, but that nonetheless creates an echo of something within itself. And there's always a kind of comfort and a kind of music in that. And it changes subtly, and then you realize, oh, suddenly we're listening to a different vowel sound rather than that. And that's part of the way of indicating that the poem has turned an auditory corner. But then this is in a book called Kitchen Hymns, and I suppose I wanted to locate the conversation about religion in a domestic setting. So, the other speaker in it, my friend, this did happen, where I say, yes, I said I do, but I don't know to who. And then she said, whom? Which was delicious to talk about language in the context of this. And ultimately, this is the unfolding of language. But then even more than that, it's the unfolding of sustenance and nurture and the kind of hospitality that a good friendship is. Let's get started on the soup. And that was the real interest to me.
Lovely.
Stanley Kunitz, a great American poet, said about a poem, finish with an image, don't explain it. And this isn't quite finishing with an image, but it is finishing with the word soup.
Lovely. So I want to come back to Yeats in a moment that you just mentioned. But before we go there, so you're spending most of your time in the States these days. And I wonder...
in the land of the free and the home of the brave.
That's right. And so I wonder... I do remember the last time we did an interview, you saying something like that you don't presume that what might work in Ireland is going to work in Palestine or is going to work in the Sudan or I don't remember your examples, but that you don't presume that the particularities of conflict there are easily translatable elsewhere. That being said, I wonder what's especially standing out to you about the current American political moment and the particular, what are you observing about the particularities of our hostilities or the particularities of our refusal to give an accountability for our use of language and so forth?
Well, it's a hard question to answer, Lee, because I am a foreigner, and even though I'm living in this country now, it's too easy and arrogant to think that somebody from outside understands. I'm not neutral, of course. I'd know pretty much the way I'd vote were I to live here, but there has been an escalation, I think, especially in a two-party political system like you have here, and other places do not have that necessarily, and that's a benefit. There has been an escalation that who you vote for is who you are, and that will fail you because politics is about winning every 4 years or 5 years or 3 years, depending as to what the cycle is in your particular democracy. And so that is giving an enormous amount about who you are away to somebody whose job it is to exploit that for the purposes of winning a political election. And I don't mean exploit in a negative sense, that like they just need you to vote for them. And that will fail if you think that is the fullness of who you are. And there's regular reminders every day. I'm a big radio listener. Every day, I hear radio or I read things in newspapers that are trying to remind people to say that who you vote for is only one element of who you are. There's other ways of neighbourliness. There's ways of helping. There's other ways within which people band together and come together. And I do think at the moment there is an easy way to exploit outrage. And I'm not saying that the outrage is that I'm not outraged myself, but it isn't enough, because the exploitation to outrage is part of what is sometimes keeping people apart and fostering an idea of them over there. And that will fail. That will fail all of us when beyond the question as to who's in power, there is the question as to who are we. And there are many other powerful, authoritative voices in the American intellectual project, writing over the last, couple of 100 years, and then writing like Joy Harjo does from an American tradition that is thousands of years old, that remind us of something else. And that is necessary, especially in an era when you are being easily manipulated and pulled apart.
So with regard to Yeats, you mentioned a moment ago, you have commented that you have a preference for his later work. I think the phrase was because it carries the wisdom of failure.
Yeah, it does.
So my first question about that is, describe that for us just a bit, of how you see that operating in him. And then I'll have a follow-up about why that's attractive to you.
Well, I mean, Yeats was writing sophisticated and brilliant poetry from an early age. He was from an Anglo-Irish family. He didn't speak Irish fluently, but he spoke it enough that he'd learned from the servants in the house. Mm-hmm. He was Irish enough for the British and British enough for the Irish in that way. He really was part of that kind of set of Anglo-Irishism. And his early poetry, some of it is deeply moving, and lots of it is kind of extrapolating on mythologies that people would have told in Irish, and he's writing them through a lens of a certain form of kind of poetic English language formalism. They're studied and they're weighty, and they're sometimes trying to prove their own importance. And as years went by, his poetry became far less burdened by him trying to do that. He wasn't trying to prove too much anymore. Instead, he was trying to make his language simpler. When you are old and full of sleep, I will go down now to the Lake Isle of Innisfree. These ways, I read a commentary where he was looking at the Lake Isle of Innisfree, which is a beautiful, beautiful, simple poem that he wrote later in life. And even then, after he'd written it, he was going, there's a word I could have taken out because I was trying to be a little bit too poetic, when in fact this word could have been removed, and the final sentence could have been even more open. And that's that commentary of him on him, I find very, very moving and very interesting. And it's an invitation, once you have maybe learned some of the training wheels of poetry or any form of art, and perhaps you feel the need, and people probably demand it to you, to prove your place within the art form, that if 50 years later you're still proving your place in the art form, well, then you've missed out an enormous amount of something else. And ultimately, none of us will feel like we totally belong. It's easy at the age of 20 to say, I need to prove I belong to this. But hopefully at the age of 50, you think, I don't belong to anything. I'm here just trying to write, and I'm here just trying to see and make afresh with the emptiness of the exhalation and the potential of the inhalation, that which I can do. Of course, you're holding all your learning, but you're hopefully holding it lightly. And that as a psychology of aging interests, and a psychology of art and aesthetics interests me enormously.
So what would be some examples for you in which that wisdom of failure or that wisdom of aging has taken specific form in your life or your work?
Well, I mean, I'm never going to be accurate in terms of talking about my own wisdom. Because anybody who knows me might say, well, here, you're not very wise. Or they might say, well, that which you say you're becoming wiser about is inaccurate, Pádraig. So with all of that provisos there, I suppose I look to how it is that noticing is an explicit part of my art now, that I'm really interested in writing about birds, or writing about the light in the air, or writing about the richness of the night air, or that which is also there. That has changed me over the last 5 years of being more attuned to that. I grew up in the countryside, so it's not like I was away from that. But the connection to it has something to do with time. I'm 50 later on this year. It has something to do with locale, something to do with a concern for the environment. I don't know. But it also has a displacement, because it's that interest is seeing myself as a growing thing among growing things, and a dying thing among dying things. Hopefully, I'll make good compost. And to think about what it means to make good compost in terms of your life, in terms of what you do. That interests me. I mean, there's a whole variety of poems that are particularly attuned to that. The last poem in Kitchen Hymns is a poem called Untitled / Misse. Misse is the word in Latin from which we get the word in English mission. Also the word mass for, a religious service. It means to go. I should say the last word in this poem is a sound. It sounds like a word, but it's a sound. You'll know what I mean when I get to it. Untitled Misse. I bless myself in the name of the deer and ox, the heron and the hare, evangelists of land and wood and air, the fox as well, that red predator of chickens, prey of cars, and the salmon and the trout sleeping in the reeds. When the wren wakes, I'll ask her blessing, and if she comes out, she'll bring it. The squirrel buries where she thinks no one else can see. I bless myself in her secrecy. There's a field mouse I've seen scampering at dusk, picking up the seeds dropped by the finches and the tits throughout the day. Some nest of frenzy waits her kindness and her pluck. I go in the name of all of them, their chaos and their industry, their replacements, their population, their forgettable ways, their untamed natures, their ignorance of why or how or who. I did have an owl mentioned in that poem, but then I thought I'd rather hear the owl rather than mention it. So that's the last. Nietzsche had a question about, the why, the how, the who. And so there's a little reference to Nietzsche in that. But for me, it is elevated by being interrupted by the sound of an owl at night.
Been talking to Pádraig Ó Tuama, poet, theologian, peacemaker. Pádraig, it's been lovely talking with you today, and grateful so much for your beautiful work in the world and your beautiful spirit. Thank you so much.
When cool, creamy ranch meets tangy, bold buffalo, the whole is greater than the sum of its sauce. Say howdy, partner, to new Buffalo Ranch sauce. Only at McDonald's for a limited time.
At participating McDonald's.
The holidays are in full swing, and Abercrombie Kids has everything on their wish list.
Check it all off during their Get Gifting sale. Start with festive outfits like sweaters and dresses for holiday parties. Then finish up with cozy sweatshirts and sweatpants made to mix and match all winter and beyond. Get gifting with Abercrombie Kids in the app, online, and in stores.
Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible. Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Carriet Harmon, Jason Cheesley, Sophie Byard, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, and Audrey Griffith. Our theme song was composed by Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of Tokens Media, LLC, and
Great Feeling Studios.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.